What crime did during Prohibition and the Great Depression in America? From the 1920s through the early 1930s, America had an unprecedented prohibition of alcohol. What were the costs and consequences of prohibition? The 18th Amendment of 1919 banned the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcoholic beverages in the United States between 1920 and 1933. Believing that prohibition could stop alcoholism and address public health and social problems such as domestic violence, the U.S. government embarked on a policy that later proved to be one of the most ill-conceived in history: prohibition. What were the intentions behind this alcohol prohibition, and how did Americans react to prohibition? What were the far-reaching consequences of prohibition, and how did it affect our understanding of American society in the 1920s and 1930s? This article delves into the troubling history of prohibition. The temperance movement in the United States before prohibition, advocating moderation or abstinence from drinking. The temperance movement in the United States took root in the early 1800s. This was a time when binge drinking among men was extremely prevalent. It was reported that the average adult male consumed between 7 and 12 gallons of alcohol per year. This was becoming a social problem, causing new problems such as domestic violence and crime. As a result, women especially supported the temperance movement. This was also motivated for religious reasons, as women, especially middle-class Protestants, upheld the Christian virtues of moderation and prudence. By 1831, there were already 24 women's organizations in various parts of the country promoting the ideals and benefits of temperance. Some of their methods included confrontation, picketing, and sit-ins in saloons, breweries, and distilleries frequented by men. When the temperance movement gained momentum in the 1870s, temperance advocates began preaching sermons and hymns against drinking in saloons to stop the sale of alcohol in the Midwest and West. The road to the 18th Amendment. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, led by President Francis Willard, was founded to advocate nationwide prohibition of alcohol. Willard's work to promote temperance went hand in hand with her efforts for women's suffrage, education, and welfare. In 1893, the Anti-Saloon League was founded and led by political tactician Wayne Wheeler. Wheeler was later instrumental in pushing for a constitutional amendment banning alcohol, especially with the outbreak of World War I. Observing the rise of anti-German sentiment, Wheeler and his circle cleverly exploited patriotism and American discontent with German-American beer producers to advance their agenda. They successfully persuaded Congress to pass the Wartime Prohibition Act, laying a solid foundation for an eventual 18th Amendment. In August 1917, the U.S. Senate voted in favor of the amendment, and the House of Representatives did the same 4 months later. In January 1919, the 18th Amendment became law and was to go into effect a year later, in 1920. Chasing alternatives, finally, the more than century-long crusade against drinking had come to an end. The proponents of sobriety had won. All of American society was in turmoil as people reacted differently to the one-size-fits-all approach to alcohol prohibition. Almost overnight, saloons, breweries, and distilleries across the country had to close, and Americans had to find alternative ways to acquire booze. Illegal bars, which sold alcohol away from the prying eyes of the law, quickly proliferated among those who wanted to drink in secret. The secretive nature of drinking houses also made them a haven for the flappers of the Roaring Twenties, as rebellious women found somewhat public places to drink. Avid drinkers also looked to places such as drugstores and churches, where legal liquor was allowed, as well as bootlegging syndicates that had ways to procure alcohol, both low and high quality. Bootleggers often smuggled alcohol using vehicles with hidden compartments that could elude law enforcement. The lucrative bootlegging industry in the 1920s was run by organized crime syndicates that controlled large-scale interstate liquor smuggling. Al Capone, the legendary mob boss, made more than $60 million a year supplying counterfeit liquor to his chain of drinking establishments in the late 1920s. Desperate times call for desperate measures. During Prohibition, many people turned to homemade alternatives. The term bathtub gin was coined to describe any type of liquor that was illegally made at home. These drinks were often of poor quality and were said to be potent poisons due to questionable ingredients such as rotten meat and chemicals. Contrary to its name, the alcoholic products were not made in an actual bathtub, but were stored there. It has been estimated that in 1929, Americans produced nearly 700 million gallons of homebrewed beer. Those who produced this illegally distilled alcohol were called moonshiners, and they were one of the supply channels for bootleggers during Prohibition. Some of the alcohol produced by moonshiners eventually made its way to drinking establishments across the country through the bootlegger network. However, the poor quality of bathtub gin prevented bartenders from using it in this form. Ingredients such as carbonated drinks, fruits, and juices had to be used to mask the taste of the poor quality booze. This process was later credited with inventing many of the classic cocktails we love today. Organized crime flourished. One of the major and disastrous consequences of Prohibition was the rise of organized crime in the United States. From Gambino to Colombo, several notorious Italian-American crime syndicates made their fortunes from large-scale bootlegging operations and underground establishments during Prohibition. Territorial clashes and gang violence were commonplace during this period, as rival gangs competed for the lion's share of the dry pie. The most infamous incident was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. 7 men associated with Irish gangster George Bugs Moran were gunned down by uniformed police officers in a chaotic North Chicago neighborhood. The tragedy was widely believed to have stemmed from rivalry between Moran's gangs and Al Capone's, although there was no official evidence indicating Al Capone's involvement. End of Prohibition. As gang violence and increased criminal activity further destabilized an already chaotic American society, public sentiment began to tilt toward repeal of the law. This was compounded by the sobering realization that the Prohibition laws were not being properly enforced, as Americans during this period never stopped drinking. Even dry Americans became increasingly frustrated because law enforcement never caught the bootleggers and gangsters. More often than not, it was police officers and federal agents who took bribes in exchange for turning a blind eye to criminal activity. During the Great Depression of 1929, the American economy went into a downward spiral, with millions of people losing their jobs and declaring bankruptcy. Under such circumstances, liquor and tax revenues proved a viable lifeline for an economy in ruins. Future U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would campaign for the 1932 election on the very premise that the re-legalization of liquor would increase federal revenues by several $100 million a year. In addition, repeal of Prohibition was also seen as a direct solution to the growing problem of unemployment. Taking advantage of this momentum, Congress passed the 21st Amendment in 1933, which repealed the 18th Amendment and legalized liquor again, assessing the years of Prohibition. Finally, after 13 long years, Prohibition came to an end. Across the United States, enthusiastic drinkers drank in the taste of hard-earned freedom and affirmed the wonders of alcohol. The repeal of Prohibition was the only time in American history that a constitutional amendment was passed to repeal another, and caused many to wonder if such an ill-conceived law was even necessary to enforce. Has Prohibition had positive results, if any at all, and how far has it strayed from its good intentions? First, Prohibition has had serious consequences for the United States economy. It caused tens of thousands of people to lose their livelihoods as the alcohol industry took an instant hit. Bars, breweries, distilleries, liquor stores, and saloons were shut down, and professions such as winemakers, truckers, and waiters, became irrelevant overnight, leaving thousands of people unemployed. At the government level, billions in tax revenue from the liquor trade were lost, and another $300 million had to be spent to enforce prohibition. Has prohibition had positive results, if any at all, and how far has it strayed from its good intentions? First, prohibition had serious consequences for the economy of the United States. It caused tens of thousands of people to lose their livelihoods as the alcohol industry took an instant hit. Bars, breweries, distilleries, liquor stores, and saloons were shut down, and professions such as winemakers, truckers, and waiters became irrelevant overnight, leaving thousands of people unemployed. At the government level, billions in tax revenue from the liquor trade were lost, and another $300 million had to be spent to enforce prohibition. If economic consequences were to be the inevitable result of a moral decision, did prohibition even achieve what it set out to achieve? As history and the Americans of the 1920s have shown, reality could not have been further from expectations. It has been shown that despite the initial decline, alcohol consumption in the years that followed rose dramatically to about 60–70% of pre-1920 levels. Thousands of people also died each year from drinking lower-quality alcohol in large quantities due to perceived scarcity. However, historical data showed that death rates from cirrhosis of the liver and alcoholism dropped significantly after prohibition went into effect. It was also evident that workplace attendance improved, indicating that controlling alcohol consumption was beneficial to productivity. Despite this, given the severe socio-political costs and economic consequences of prohibition, the American experiment in curbing alcoholism was a spectacular failure. Thriving organized crime painted a vivid picture of the fallibility of law enforcement and, ultimately, the law's inability to regulate human behavior. At a time when America, the land of the free, was forced to dry up, Americans proved that their incredible resourcefulness and love of alcohol knew no bounds.